Welcome to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast, a podcast hosted by Marcelo Aevi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium. We aim to draw a map of the state of criminology across Europe through the words of contemporary criminologists. How is criminology defined and taught? Which are the main lines of research? Which are the main schools of thought in each country? These and many other questions are answered here by fellow researchers who share their vision on the development of criminology in their countries from its beginnings to the second decade of the 21st century. If you want to know and compare their stories, stay tuned.
Today we are interviewing Krzysztof Krajewski. Krzysztof Krajewski is professor of criminology and head of the Department of Criminology at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. He is a former president of the European Society of Criminology and also member of the board of the European Journal of Criminology and many others, both Polish and international journals. Professor Krajewski studied both law and sociology and has been member of the advisory board of the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction, the EMCDDA, since 2008. This interview was conducted on the 25th of November 2022. Welcome, Professor Krajewski. We are very pleased to have you in our podcast series. Let's just go ahead and talk about the topics we've been talking about in all our previous editions. As you know, we compare situations across European countries and want to give our listeners a view of different developments, different emphasis in research and teaching criminology as a broad. So let's start with the probably most difficult question, and that is the question related to the definition of criminology as it exists in Poland. How would you define criminology in Poland?
Well, it's probably the trickiest question, really. As you mentioned, it's absolutely true that in Anglo-American countries, the definition of criminology is rather clear. But it's not necessarily the case in Europe, and the more eastward you move, things become probably less clear in that respect. But in principle, the first thing that criminology is usually strictly in Poland in terms of teaching and research, always was and still is to a large extent related to teaching law and legal science, etc., or to say. So it means that we criminologists exist primarily within law faculties, and most prevailing, overwhelming majority of criminologists are lawyers by education, sometimes with some supplementary, let's say, studies in social science, but it's not always the case. So even from the formal point of view, because there are some, provisions on classification of the disciplines of research and science, etc., we are classified as within legal science, and it sometimes creates strange situations. There is one colleague who is 100% sociologist at one of the Polish universities, and he does think since some time exclusively related to criminology, and he wanted to start some sort of procedure to become full professor. And it was a problem to find reviewers, because in principle, his reviewers should be sociologists, because he is sociologist. But there are no sociologists competent in criminology in Poland, or too many of them. So it was supposed that he will have lawyers as his reviewers, and it was extremely complicated situation. So First of all, is this legal science, which has a very strong imprint on criminology in Poland, and this creates, of course, additional problems, that there is very often not too clear border between what criminologists do and lawyers do. Lawyers who do normally with normative problems related to interpretation of laws and so on. But in principle, there are many lawyers who engage in some sort of empirical research with regards law, what Germans call Rechtsstaatssachenforschung. It means the research on how laws are applied, how function in practice, etc. So it is not always clear distinction. There are some overlaps. There are many criminologists who do very similar things to what people considering themselves lawyers do. And second thing, what is probably even more common, that in Central and Eastern Europe since World War II, it was quite common to have at the universities departments of something what you would call in English probably forensic science. Criminalistic in German, Kriminalistik in French, it's Kriminalistika in Polish. This is, of course, something pretty specific, what is related to everything what has something to do with, investigating offenses and such things. But people doing this type of things in Poland do very often also things which have something to, which would be considered criminology elsewhere, because it's very often related to patterns of crime, to certain things related to offenders, etc., etc. And it is not necessarily, for example, the case in Krakow at my faculty, but in a few other places in Poland, there are even institutional overlaps between forensic science and criminology. And it is probably interesting that it is very often that people involved in forensic science research do things criminological, but not the other way around. Criminologists rather refrain from fingerprints, DNA, psychological profiling, and such issues. Third thing, which is probably quite recent, is probably about 10, 15 years, that there is a new growing branch. I don't know whether it's real science and real research. It is certainly some practical area, which means research related to security issues. We call it sometimes, it is a strange, no one probably uses such word in English, but we call it sometimes securitology. This is something what is, quite popular as a matter of fact, because there are many young people who want to study, to make such studies and to get degrees in those areas. People, for example, who want to work primarily in police, in border guards, in other, even, fire brigades or whatever, because it is the opportunity to get some degree. And now quite a lot of universities offer programs in security studies and security research, and it is sometimes some sort of competition for criminologists, let's say. So as you see, it is, well, not necessarily very clear. There are very many things. Nevertheless, it is probably true that for a very long time, involvement of social science, let's say, like it is the case in Anglo-American world, was, well, I wouldn't say insignificant, but it was very limited. It is changing since some time. There are increasing numbers of let's say, people, primarily psychologists, as a matter of fact, who do things criminological, to less extent probably sociologists, but it's changing, let's say. But as I said, it is not considered to be a branch of social science by majority of people, and that's probably more or less Eastern European, but to a certain extent also European pattern related to criminology.
Yes. Now that you mention it, I've seen that in some countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are even faculties of criminology, criminalistics, and security.
Yeah.
That is the case also in Poland. You have specific.
No, well, there are sometimes in some private schools, there may be eventually either equivalents of faculties or separate studies, types of studies devoted exclusively to those things related to security. In big universities, I would say, well, best universities, there are some, well, institutes, departments, but they are usually either at the Jagiellonian University, there is a faculty which is very strange of management or something like this, what is not necessarily related exclusively to management in terms of economy, etc., but managing everything. And it involves also managing security issues, and they have some sort of department for security studies or something like this. Although, as far as I know, they don't necessarily do things criminological. They do things related to international security and such things. The head of this department is a retired general who does things military primarily, and that's what they do. You know, so it depends, but like this pattern, like in Sarajevo or in Bosnia Herzegovina, faculties, as far as I know, do not exist. But either within law faculties or within eventually some other, it depends sometimes on personal things, etc. Some other faculties, there may be department, institute, whatever.
Yeah. So it's a kind of separation between the social science, criminology, which, as you mentioned, in Poland is more related to law, and security, more not a social science, let's say. Security in another sense. Okay.
Yeah. I would say that probably two exceptions where connection between social science and criminology is most visible is Warsaw and various institutions dedicated to criminology in Warsaw and Krakow. But otherwise, it's not necessarily so.
Okay. And so about the institutes of criminology in Poland, we know your work in Krakow, but can you give us a general idea of which is the situation?
Well, we have normally, the faculties at the universities are, let's say, divided into institutes or departments, or we have also this German system of Lehrstühls, you know. In Krakow, we have Lehrstühls. In Warsaw, they have primarily institutes. And if you search for anything having criminology in its name, institute, department, Lehrstuhl, you have it only in Warsaw at the law faculty. There is Department of Criminology. And in Krakow, you have my Lehrstuhl of Criminology. And there is also in Olsztyn, that is in north of Poland, in German, it was Allenstein, which is a relatively new university, and they have also Department of Criminology. And those are probably only three institutions which are criminology pure, let's say, nothing else. Everywhere else, you have some sort of combination between criminology and something else. And this something else sometimes is more important than criminology. For example, in Białystok, where Emil Pływaczewski, whom you probably know, is or was, because he retired just a couple of months ago, there is Department of Penal Law and Criminology. In Gdańsk, it is also penal law and criminology. In some place, in Lublin, it is also so, I think. Sometimes it's combined forensic science or criminalistic and criminology. So it is sometimes like in Germany that you have also very few Lehrstühls. There is no Lehrstuhl für Kriminologie only, or one or two probably. It is usually combined what they call penitentiary law and criminology. So people who, even if you don't have criminology department at some universities, but there is department for penitentiary law or prison studies or something like this, they do very often things criminological without having it in the name of the department. But if you try to search for, let's say, research and teaching institutions devoted to criminology, there are not too many in Poland.
Okay, but that must have some impact on the programs which are taught.
Certainly.
So depending on your choice, you have a different curriculum, or
in most cases, criminology courses are made for law students. And this is, of course, something extremely problematic because you have to limit yourself and make yourself understandable, let's say, for students who usually have no background in social science, in methodology of social research, and such things. So it's the case in Krakow also, because we do various criminological courses to law students, although my course in criminology is also attended by students from other faculties, mainly psychologists and sociologists. But otherwise, it is for law students. And it means, of course, as I said, enormous limitation. It must be somehow law-related, legal practice related, because otherwise it is beyond the possibilities of comprehension, let's say, of our of attendees of those programs. And it is a huge problem. It is not only in Krakow, it is also at other universities, with exceptions, some, of course, because there is criminology in Warsaw at the university, there are two, let's say, institutes or departments of criminology. One is like mine within the law faculty, and that's a classical pattern. Monika Platek was and still is there. The other is at the faculty with very, very strange name, Faculty of Social Prophylaxis and Resocialization. It's institute within the Faculty of Applied Social Science. And this is something what has overwhelmingly sociological and psychological character. Most people there are sociologists or psychologists, although there are also some lawyers. And what they do, because the students there receive their degrees in social science, not in law, but in social science. And this makes those studies different. They really do applied social science also in the area of criminology, and they do teach in that way. They prepare mainly, let's say, students who later on work in social welfare institutions, probation officers, this type of stuff. So this is probably the only institute which does think criminological from social science perspective, although law is always present there too, and some of the people there are lawyers. Otherwise, if you have master programs, for example, or bachelor programs in criminology, because there are some universities with bachelor programs in criminology, they are usually attached anyway to law faculties, but they try to combine various things. Honestly speaking, depending on the local, let's say, forces, availability of faculty members and people who can contribute in more or less reasonable way to those programs. That was, as a matter of fact, for example, a problem for me, because I was thinking about opening master program in criminology in Krakow, and we came to the conclusion that we don't have enough specialists to provide a really reasonable program of studies within the university, because anyway we would have to borrow people from sociology, psychology, whatever, But even considering this, there was not probably enough staff to guarantee quality, let's say. And that's very often the problem at some other universities that, they do various programs, although, let's say, it's sometimes problematic. And therefore, because I think that organizing master programs in criminology is absolutely reasonable, makes sense. There are many students who, let's say, finish their bachelor degrees in sociology, psychology, political science, whatever, and they are interested in continuing in the direction of criminology. But there are one or two universities which do bachelor programs in criminology, and to be honest, I have very serious doubts about this, whether it makes sense, and what would be also, the perspectives of those people on the market, on the labor market, because here I am not certain, and therefore I never considered eventually bachelor program in criminology, but master, yes, of course, that's reasonable.
That's a very interesting issue you were talking about. I mean, this is something that's being discussed in many countries. I mean, it's obviously very important to have these master classes and master programs, because you can really have differential input. People who have a bachelor in social science know about social science methodology, so I can really see the advantage. But of course, if we have to start from scratch, that's always the big challenge. And this is something that's being discussed in many European countries. I recognize the discussion. We also had it. The question sometimes is the difference between quality and quantity. How many students do you want? And if you start at the bachelor level, you have many students, but you cannot do everything yourself. I completely agree. It's a very challenging issue.
There are serious doubts whether those bachelor programs which exist in Poland really provide sufficient quality, and whether it is something reasonable at all from the point of view of also, as I said, of finding employment later on.
But even these universities that are offering these programs, are they public or private universities? Because there is a development of private universities, no?
Most of them are public universities, but there are also some private, even in Krakow. There is a private university, which is not that much bad, let's say, because it is always a problem in Central and Eastern Europe that if you have especially some little, small private universities or high schools. For example, this private university in Krakow, which is one of the probably best private schools in Poland, they have now a program, but it is a program in public security. They do things criminological, but the studies, not legal studies, but involving, let's say, public security, what means that those people are supposed to be professionals, I don't know, police, prison service eventually, and such things. The problem with private schools in Poland is that, well, like any private school, they depend on students' tuitions. And of course, Harvard depends on students' tuitions too, but they usually can be very choicy, let's say, and choose best students for them. It's not necessarily the case in Central and Eastern Europe, because those who study in private schools are not necessarily best students or best pupils in high schools, etc. They can afford paying for their studies, but it means that, that the quality is sometimes problematic also because private high schools think primarily about their income and not about the quality of teaching. So with few exceptions, of course, it's not a general thing. There are a couple of private schools which are excellent in Poland, but majority not necessarily. And the problem is that, studying something what is called criminology is attractive for young people. And usually when the university opens such possibility, it attracts enormous number of young people who very often have no foggiest idea what criminology is about. This is additional problem because they think they mix up very often criminology with criminalistics, for example, and they think that they will be, doing things related to investigation, fingerprints, DNA analysis, and such things. No, it's not what is criminology about, and this creates additional problems very often. That young people who start such studies do not know really what they are going to study at those universities or high schools. If you go to study engineering or even law, you usually know what you are going to study. But in case of criminology, it is often not so clear.
Yeah. And another indicator sometimes of the institutionalization of the discipline is the journals, and you have these archives of criminology in Poland. I'm a member of the editorial board.
Yeah. Let me put it this way. It is the only one exclusively criminological journal in Poland. This is the first one. Then it has tradition because it's under slightly different title. It appeared already before World War II. There were 4 volumes were published before 1939, including 2 of them contain very large and very important studies of statistical data on crime by Leon Radzinovich. So because before he left to UK, he was quite active in publishing and doing criminological research in Polish in Poland. So archives of criminology were suspended during the 1950s because the communists considered criminology to be a, let's say, imperialist type of science, bourgeois science, and therefore they banned criminological research and all institutional forms of criminology. It returned after 1956, and primarily in Warsaw. And at the Academy of Science, they recreated, because before the war it was Archiwum Kryminologiczne, what means criminological archives, and they reinstituted it as archives of criminology. And since that time, it was a yearbook, and only 3 years or 4 years ago, it appears every half a year. So there are 2 volumes a year. And what they did, this is Witold Klaus, who is now editor-in chief, that they try also to be much more international, let's say, and to publish primarily in English. At least a couple of articles in each volume are in English, and it is, let's say, decent English, because they have people who do copy editing, native speakers who do copy editing for them, and they do it very competently. So there are even some issues which were completely in English. And well, I would say that probably the original idea was to make archives of criminology some sort of journal for Central European criminology. But now I think they go beyond this, because certainly there are also things, especially special issues, which they publish, which are well, not only European, truly European, but even global sometimes. So it is, I think, quite good thing, and the direction they have taken a couple of years ago is absolutely good, and it works. Let's say it is probably the only one such journal in Central Europe which is above the purely national level and impact. Otherwise, there was an attempt by colleagues from Gdańsk to start English language, exclusively English language journal. It was called Polish Journal of Criminology. And it was supposed to be, I think, published 4 times a year, like many journals. But I think they ran out of money. They had some sort of grant from the research ministry, but it was enough for 3 years only, I think. They haven't received any more financial support, and as far as I know, since 4 years or something like this journal is not appearing, let's say. Otherwise, there are, of course, various journals which do and publish things criminological, but they are, well, interdisciplinary journals related to legal, primarily some legal things, and usually they don't publish in other languages. They do publish only in Polish. That's current situation. There is also one strange thing which is extremely frustrating, not only for criminologists but also for all researchers in this country, but for researchers in social science, law, and relevant areas, it is primarily something very, very frustrating. We have, namely, what is probably known everywhere in Europe and in the world, that for publishing, the journals are assessed with regards to the quality, etc., and you receive for publishing in a journal a certain amount of credits, let's say, the researcher, the scholar. And up till 2015, there was a special independent committee within the research ministry. They were reviewing every couple of years the journals and assigning those credits in more or less independent and, let's say, reasonable, objective way. Since 2015, as you may know, I do not want to be too much political, but nevertheless, we have some political problems in Poland, and current government or current research ministry did things absolutely appalling, because they assign now those credits to journals absolutely at will. There are no clear criteria, no clear procedures, it's not transparent, and therefore, to give you just example, there are two journals which are more or less related or connected to the Ministry of Justice. In one of them, the Minister of Justice is even head of editorial board. Especially one of those journals used to be quite reasonable up till 2015. But now, one of them is devoted to penitentiary problems and prison law and such things. Now, who publishes in this journal? Practically only people working in prison administration. And you receive for the article published in this journal 100 credits. Says nothing at the moment to you. There is also other journal published by the Ministry of Justice for which you receive also 100 credits. Archives of Criminology, for Archives of Criminology, you receive 70 credits. There is also such a journal, State and Law. It is published by the Academy of Science. It's certainly the best legal journal in Poland, with enormous tradition, very good, high quality, etc., etc. For publishing in this journal, you receive also 70 credits. So, poor quality journals, for political reasons, are graded much higher than really established high quality traditional journals. And this is something extremely frustrating. Under current conditions, there is no way to change this. The most troublesome aspect of this is that it is what some people from current government admit, that this is an attempt to corrupt young people and to send texts to those journals, because for me it doesn't matter whether I publish there or there, but for young people it is very important because it has impact on how they are evaluated by their employers. And if you do this exclusively in those quantitative terms of number of credits you have collected during a year or two, it is obvious that for young people, it is understandable that they attempt to publish in those highly valued in terms of credits journals, which are not necessarily really good journals. And it is also, the problem is that it is very often much easier to get texts accepted in those journals than, let's say, in archives of criminology or other journals.
Because probably these journals also have a certain line, a certain editorial line.
Well, that probably, in case you send something very critical about current things going on within criminal justice system, rule of law, etc., in Poland, you may risk not having it accepted, While in archives of criminology or in State and Law on few other journals, such things doesn't matter because it's quality what counts and not political stance, let's say.
I have to ask you this because, it seems quite incredible in the 21st century to be in this situation and to have governments that take autocratic positions in Europe. Do you think that the people that are publishing in this in archives of criminology, or the people that are critical to the regime, the risks they are incurring currently?
Well, I would say at the moment, no, probably, especially if you are, let's say, at big, respectable, established university. Because among, let's say, researchers, scholars, officials at that university, no one usually thinks in terms of applying criteria other than quality. In smaller places, well, both state and private, it is, I wouldn't be so 100% certain. Anyway, I would say that what regards Warsaw, Krakow, Gdańsk, Poznań, Wrocław, those are the largest and most prestigious universities in Poland. I've never heard about anyone suffering anything because of the critical position. I would say that what regards especially law faculties is quite somehow understandable, because usually overwhelming majority of faculty members are critical, not necessarily for purely political reasons, but just for professional, legal reasons, etc., that all this what the government is doing is something unacceptable, as you said, in 21st century, in a country which is member of the European Union. Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
But I would say that everything depends on the outcome of the elections next year, because if Law and Justice wins the third term, I will be retired already. but I cannot guarantee what they will try to or attempt to do also with universities, because they try, at least without too much success, but to establish some sort of alternative universities or high schools with absolutely clear political agenda, let's say. Although they do this with not too much success sometimes. There is a very famous, extremely conservative Catholic lawyers organization, which is called Ordo Iuris. And they established some sort of, it's not university, it's some sort of legal possibility to study law or something like this. And they did it 3 years ago, I think. And for the first 2 years, they had some number of candidates. Last year, they accepted 4 students, and those were all candidates they had. So at the moment, I read it in the press, they had something like 40 faculty members and 4 students accepted for the first year of the studies. So it is clearly political, ideological initiative, let's say, although not necessarily so far very successful in terms of demand for this kind of education, let's say.
Yes. I didn't realize that the level of control of the government was so important and went up to these kind of levels, because many times when there is an autocratic regime, we tend to blame it only on the leader, but this kind of corruption of the system, of giving more points to one journal to the other, is very sophisticated, and it requires collaboration. So it means that,
that's well, you know, it's true that they are probably a little bit more sophisticated than some, you know, primitive dictators, let's say.
Yes. Yeah. So you keep the other journals, but you touch them instead of forbidding them. Then you reduce the impact, and then you force the new generations to go to the ones that give more points. It's really quite sophisticated, and it requires a lot of collaboration from people that agree with the regime. It's something that one tends to forget.
This is because of the cost-benefit system that young people slowly but surely, I mean, collaborate with the ideas of the regime because they're, I mean, able to get success, and then they are oblivious to all the other problems. I mean, would that also in the long run be a danger for example, the Polish Society of Criminology? Because, I mean, if there is pressure of the government.
Well, at the moment, I don't think so, because they don't consider this society to be of any importance. This is something what functions in a way and in the areas which at the moment are probably not considered to be important for the government. You know, the impact, the influence is extremely limited, because in terms of having any kind of public impact, there is probably no impact at all. I don't remember, well, we took as a society, we took for a couple of times certain specific positions regarding some criminological issues, some pieces of legislation, etc., etc. And it was always so. It was not only after 2015. But you know, the membership of this society is not very significant. It's probably something around 100 members, which is rather a small society, especially considering the size of Poland. And I don't think that it ever was considered to be any sort of a troublemaker or problem. Therefore, at the moment, there is nothing endangering, I think, independence and such things with regards society. What will happen in the future is sometimes difficult to provide. It is usually two ways to deal with the problem, either to attempt to take over or to create, as I said already, alternatives. And in few areas, it was already completely other areas. it was already created to attempted to create such government-friendly alternatives, let's say, but not in this area.
But talking about alternatives, it might, for example, be that there is an attempt to establish, for example, a Polish society of security science, which
Why
may
not?
be much more related to government interesting
Yeah.
topics. I don't know.
Why not? It's a good idea, as a matter of fact.
Sorry, I didn't want to bring up good ideas.
Don't be too clever,
No, okay.
as you always are. So, yeah, is there something, Krzysztof, that you think we, the ones who are lucky to live in, let's say, fully democratic societies, is there something that we could do to help solve this situation without hurting the ones that are doing the job? Because you said you are the people that are in the big universities are the critical ones. Huh?
It is a problem because it is certainly a completely different situation than, let's say, in countries like Belarus, which is an outright, simple, unsophisticated, brutal dictatorship. But I would say that even different than many people say this, than in Hungary, for example. Because still, let's say, Polish situation reminds me enormously American situation, as a matter of fact. Society split in two, Trumpists and Bidenists. In Poland, it would be supporters of law and justice and people who are against law and justice, let's say. And therefore, I would say that control by the government over various things is not so total as even in Hungary, because there are still huge number of independent institutions. There is still local self-government. For example, law and justice does not govern probably one single larger city in Poland. They have central government, but they do not govern on the local level, especially in big cities. Therefore, I would say that the need for some, let's say, support, help, etc., is not probably that much acute at the moment. It is completely different than under the communist time, when let's say civil society was helpless and totally dependent on support from outside. At the moment, probably it's not that bad. The problem is primarily to reverse this tendency in the future. And as I said, elections next year will be of decisive for this. Let me give you one example. During the last few days, we were arranging a campaign against legislation adopted some time ago by the parliament. It is the changes into penal code. Changes into penal code which will, if they enter into force, would throw back Polish penal law to communist times, as a matter of fact. It is only two examples, patterns well known from Hungary. Life imprisonment without parole, for example, what is the darling, let's say. Can you imagine such a thing introduced in a country where murder rate goes down significantly since about 15 years? So what's the need for this? Or possibility of applying this life imprisonment without parole to 14 years old. That's something beyond imagination. And we arranged a widespread, among lawyers, of course, campaign of signing appeal to the president to veto this legislation. And of course, such things happen very often in this country, that certain milieus, certain groups mobilize against the government, and this may have sometimes impact. Even they sometimes they already a couple of times reversed their decisions. Therefore, there are still internal possibilities to do something. And of course, the most important thing is the voting behavior of certain parts of the population. This must change if real political change and return to normal situation has to take place. So at the moment, I would say that there is, of course, constantly pressure from European Commission, European Parliament, and other bodies to do something about this rule of law problem, because it's the only one problem, as a matter of fact. Otherwise, it is more or less democratically elected government, and therefore they have some sort of legitimacy. But otherwise, they do, within this legitimacy, they do things absolutely unacceptable from the point of view of modern democracy, rule of law, division of powers, and certain things. But as I said, there are still various bodies at the European level which are involved. It is not only European Commission or Parliament. Those are various judicial associations, for example, or other bodies which try to exert impact. This could, of course, regard also scholarly associations, but I would say that it would require something very, very specific to intervene and to take position, because in general terms, it wouldn't be efficient. I would say no one would notice this probably among the government people. It would have to be something really terrible. For example, not only life imprisonment without parole, but reinstituting death penalties, let's say. Yeah. What is probably absolutely unlikely. They would like to do this, but they know that it would mean polexit, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, outside of the Council of Europe. So, I was asking you this because sometimes, we think we have clever ideas, or let's make a letter of support, and you make a letter of support, and then you are blacklisting the good persons because you're supporting persons.
There will be no such effect, I think, because they have own blacklists, and they know perfectly well who is on those blacklists. So it is not, as I said, it is not like a terrible dictatorship, because most people still, especially, let's say, among, people my age or even much younger, who have their positions, who have their reputation, etc., they express their views absolutely openly. And at the moment, no one tried to make any consequences out of this, with exception of certain, but those does not happen often, that sometimes they attempt to sue someone in court for, slander or something like this. But still, on the average, courts are not controlled to that extent that they are maybe certain of the judgment, So that's still not guaranteed that courts are absolutely obedient.
But that's a typical strategy, for example, with satiric journals. They start process, and then the amount of money they have to spend, these journals, for example, to pay the lawyers becomes so big that you cannot continue.
Well, there is a danger, and many journalists are afraid of such things. But there is one additional thing, that some, at least, of the journals, but also TV stations, are foreign owned. And this complicates for the government matters extremely. One of the most critical TV stations, which they have excellent also news channel, let's say, TVN, they are owned by Americans. Warner Bros. Owns this. So they tried to do various things, but finally gave up because Americans were absolutely explicit about eventual consequences of meddling into this news channel.
Okay. We know how the contemporary situation is. If we try to go back a little bit to the development of criminology in Poland, I don't know when it really started, criminology, because our reference is always Radzinovich, but
one of the most spectacular, let's say, personalities. Publications of criminological character or discussions of criminological issues started, as a matter of fact, probably at the end of 19th century, as a matter of fact. L'Uomo Delinquente was published in Polish in 1897, for example.
The first edition.
Yeah. So it was quite quick after original has been published. So there was interest in criminology, and therefore there were people doing things criminological, although never under the name of criminology, because it did not exist at that time. But there were at least a couple of famous social scientists, sociologists, who devoted parts of their publications to things related to crime. One of them was very prominent Marxist sociologist Ludwik Krzyżewski, very well-known personality among sociologists, who did write also on criminology. There were also, of course, lawyers who were doing things criminological, especially under the influence of the sociological school of penal law and positive school in criminology. There was a very famous professor of penal law, one who created the Polish Penal Code of 1932, who was pupil of the Franz von Liszt. So he was really well known in German-speaking areas, and he was a staunch supporter of the sociological school of penal law, and he published also intensively on things, in fact, criminological. So it is probably similar to many other European countries, where it started with lawyers and sometimes with doctors. Especially in Krakow, in southern Poland, there were a couple of prominent people who were engaged in forensic medicine, and they did also things criminological, as a matter of fact. So the origins are quite early, although, as I said, no one considered or used the name criminology at that time. After World War I, it was quite interesting because, as some of you may know, or you may know, Radzinovich, he prepared his PhD under Enrico Ferri. After he did this, it was, I think, 1922 or something like this. He was teaching 2 or 3 years in Geneva, somewhere. I'm not sure where, but he was a private docent here in Switzerland. And then he returned to Poland and was interested in eventually establishing something criminological in Poland, and moreover at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And it was Well, some people in Krakow were interested eventually in this and started to prepare eventually something for him. Of course, it would require, there was no other way at that time, it would require to create a department or Lehrstuhl in criminology. Those attempts finally failed, and Radzinovich moved to Warsaw, but to the only one private university which existed at that time in Poland. And he has been lecturing criminology for a couple of years in Warsaw at this private university, and publishing, doing research. There were also some other sociologists at that private university who were doing things criminological together with Radzinovich. Of course, Radzinovich left, it was 36 or 37, and to UK and stayed in UK. But there were some other people in Warsaw at that time who were already doing things criminological. Primarily, it was Professor Stanisław Batavia, he was a psychiatrist, as a matter of fact, and lawyer by education, and he was one of the other criminologists in Poland, publishing already things purely criminological, books, articles, etc., etc. There was also, it's an interesting story, a person in Poznań at the university. His name was Stanisław Kuczma, who was somehow pupil of this famous Polish-American sociologist Florian Znaniecki, or Znaniecki, as we pronounce this, because Znaniecki was in Poznań also between two world wars. And it was Znaniecki who contacted, I think, Edwin Sutherland, and Kuczma spent 2 or 3 years with Sutherland in Chicago. So he was, to a certain extent, Sutherland's pupil. Unfortunately, he was killed by Germans during the Second World War. So there were some origins of criminology, also weak, but even to a certain extent institutional, at least personal, although there was no formally any kind of department with the name criminology in it, neither in Krakow, nor in Warsaw, nor in Poznań. As I have mentioned, after World War II, communists banned criminology for some difficult to explain ideological reasons. And this situation persisted till 1956. After 1956, this ban has been lifted, and Professor Batavia, I have mentioned, re-established the Department of Criminology at the Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, and they started publishing archives of criminology, and they started to do research, empirical research. For many years, this department was really very well known in Poland for empirical research on offenders. It was for today, probably very traditional, positivist, let's say, way of approaching criminological research, but nevertheless, it was of high methodological standards, sometimes very interesting, with valuable results. That's why we know quite a lot about certain things related to crime and criminals in Poland during 1960s and 1970s. That's the result of their research. And this established, let's say, foundation for future developments during the 1980s and after fall of the Berlin Wall, because there were already some numbers of, let's say, Batavia's and other people's pupils who were taking over from this older generation. So criminology obviously expanded, especially at the end of 1970s and 1980s already, and later on it became somehow obvious, at least in quantitative terms.
Yeah, but this is, however, a very interesting part of the Polish criminological history, because I didn't expect that there would be this kind of research under the communist regime in the 1950s and 60s, because in many other communist regimes, for example, in Eastern Germany, it was only the Marxist school that was taught at universities. So you talk about more traditional criminological research on the correlates of offending, which is quite special. I mean, in this kind of context, where people were working under the Soviet regime, just to say, I mean...
To be honest, the first thing that, as I said, there were leftovers of pre-war criminology in Poland. Okay. Mm-hmm. So there were people who were educated in normal conditions and were able to conduct normal research, etc. That was the first factor. And they remained in country. They did not emigrate like it was the case in some other Central and Eastern European countries. That was the first factor. Second factor was that Poland, compared with Eastern Germany, was a different world with regards freedom of research, freedom of thought, etc. Of course, it was a communist authoritarian country, but still there were some niches, for some people at least, where they were able to do things they wanted. They had probably no practical impact whatsoever. But in terms of research, they were more or less free and able to do decent and reasonable things. And this was probably the case with Batavia and this Warsaw, let's say, circle of criminologists who were very often also regime critical, but still they were somehow tolerated. They could have sometimes troubles, problems, etc. For example, one example is interesting. He was a pupil of Batavia to a certain extent, Professor Jerzy Jasiński, the late Jerzy Jasiński, who was in Warsaw. And during the 1960s, it is a very good and very interesting study regarding comparative punitiveness of criminal justice systems in Europe, where, of course, getting data from Western Europe was no problem for him at that time. The trick was to find something about countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And he used various private contacts to obtain from some people from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Eastern Germany, some data on imprisonment, incarceration rate, prison population, and such things. That prepared really excellent study comparing primarily Polish, because here the data were available without too much problems, other Central and Eastern European countries, and Western Europe. And of course, result was obvious, but it was proven that Central and Eastern Europe or communist countries are unbelievably punitive with regards crime control policies. And it was a very, very large article he prepared, and censorship, which existed at that time, prohibited to publish it. It took, I think, 2 years for this ban to be lifted, but finally they succeeded. And the article was published without practically any changes, So that illustrates certain things, that you could have problems, you could have trouble, including censorship interventions and such things unthinkable for any other normal country, but still on many occasions, if you were persistent, you could finally succeed with doing something. Of course, this text had no practical impact whatsoever because communist authorities were not impressed by those results. But nevertheless, we have at least a very good quality documentation of certain things which were going on at that time. This was probably different in Poland because, as I said, statistical data were mostly available, both police statistical data and judicial statistical data, also data on imprisonment rate, on prison population. They were regularly even published absolutely officially in statistical yearbooks, what was not the case, for example, in Bulgaria, Romania, not to mention Soviet Union, okay? So there were some data to be used, and there were also possibilities to publish even results of this research, even if the impact of this research was either non-existent or very narrow, let's say. In some other countries, there was no even such possibility. I remember in the 1970s, someone, it was a joke, practical joke, gave me, because of some occasion, I was a young assistant at the university, a Russian handbook of criminology. And there was a chapter on criminal statistics in this. And can you imagine this? In this chapter on criminal statistics, there was no one single digit provided. Can you?
Incredible, yeah.
In that respect, Poland was probably still different than many other countries. To a certain extent, at least, it was similar in Hungary, because they had also access to statistical data and such things. In Czechoslovakia, they had it too, but only up till 1968. After 1968 and Soviet invasion, it changed completely.
Okay, this is important because you mentioned a couple of times 1956, and although I was born 10 years after that, I know what it means, the protest in 1956, but I'm not sure that younger generations, maybe especially those who are not related to Central and Eastern Europe, know exactly what happened, and perhaps what happened in Prague is more well known because of the writers. Maybe you could explain what happened for the academia.
Of course, it's history of remote region of the world. So during the 1940s, communists took over power in all countries of Eastern, of Central Europe. This was, of course, only due to the fact that Red Army in 1945 so-called liberated Central Europe from German occupation. But like many people today say, it was substitution of one occupation with other occupation, equally brutal sometimes and problematic. And of course, it would be impossible for any Central European Communist Party to take power without Red Army being present on those territories. And this was a time of, well, the first secretary, the head of the Soviet Union, Marshal Stalin, was probably one of the most brutal dictators in the history of the world, which probably equals Adolf Hitler in many respects. And as long as Stalin lived, Central Europe was governed by outright brutal terror. It was absolutely unbelievable amount of, well, brutal, cruel terror. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, imprisoned, etc., etc. Stalin died in 1953, And since that time, Soviet Union started slowly to liberalize a little bit. In 1956, several things took place. There's this party gathering of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev had his famous secret speech about Stalinist terror and Stalinist crimes. And this resulted in, let's say, progressing liberalization also throughout Eastern Europe. I would say, and many people, political scientists, sociologists say that up till 1956, Soviet Union and most countries of the region were brutal, bloody dictatorships. Starting 1956, at least Central European countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary became authoritarian countries, using also from time to time brutal methods, but certainly not to the extent like it was the case before 1956. And therefore, period before 1956 for most countries of the region is like black hole, After 1956, certain things became possible, at least, and there was no systematic, so brutal, so outright repression like it was the case earlier. Therefore, it is true that 1956 is a crucial point because many things changed in terms of politics, in terms of social life, in terms of universities, freedom of research, and such things. It was not normalization, but still it was different.
Even if in 1956 the Soviet Union sent the tanks mainly to Prague,
the result... At that time to Budapest. 56 Budapest. 56 Budapest. Yeah.
Sorry. So the result was, at least for Poland and for Hungary, was a little bit less.
Well, in Hungary, it took place during the 1960s, because immediately after the intervention, it was of course terrible. But during the 1960s, they created János Kadar, the first general secretary of the Communist Party. They created some sort of what they called goulash communism, what means providing some sort of economic stability in exchange for, let's say, political obedience of the population. In Poland, it was probably a little bit different, but still it was absolutely noticeable.
That's a very interesting discussion, because I think there are many aspects which are not so very much known, especially among the younger scholars, because I've also been teaching now for about 20 years. When I talk about the 1980s and the 1970s and the differences between Eastern and Western Europe, I see that many people don't know. The new generation has completely forgotten about all.
Because, I think that the problem is that many people consider so-called Eastern Bloc to be absolutely unified bloc.
Yeah, it's not true.
What was not the case. There were differences, and there were countries like Poland or Hungary, which enjoyed some sort of internal freedom. Mm-hmm. And there were also countries like Romania, which suffered under most bizarre dictatorship, but Romania in exchange enjoyed some freedom in foreign policy. Can you imagine that all countries of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, in 1967, after Arab-Israeli war, were forced to break diplomatic relations with Israel? Moscow did this, but not Romania. Romania was the only one country of the region which preserved diplomatic relations with Israel. So it was sometimes very, very complicated and unexpected, I would say, to a certain extent.
And different to understand, indeed, for outsiders, because the information we receive is, of course, only very limited, because not everything is being told or has been recorded. So
Krzysztof, you were born in the 50s, and this means that you received your education during the period of the communist regime, even if, as you just told us, it was a little bit less tough than before. But how was criminology? Did you get a specific education in criminology apart from law? And how was it?
No, yes and no. Well, I originally read law. During my law studies, I was approached by one of the professors who taught me at that time criminal procedure, but he was also a lawyer and sociologist by education. He graduated in both areas, and he probably, I don't know, was satisfied because we had such introductory course in sociology during the first year of studies. Lawyers had this at that time. Very useful in my opinion, not the case anymore, but nevertheless, it was interesting. And he was teaching also this course. And afterwards, after exam, he approached me and said, would I be interested in doing something in the area of criminology, because he is going to found a Department of Criminology at the Jagiellonian University. And if possibility exists, he would like to employ me. But he said, but only under one condition. You have also to study sociology and to graduate in sociology. And I said, well, okay, why not? That's interesting. And so I graduated in law and started my sociological studies, also at the Jagiellonian. And even earlier, I get employment as assistant in the Department of Criminology. And therefore, I always say that because I am a lawyer and sociologist, it makes me to criminology. And most of the people in Krakow department, all of them are lawyers, but each one has also some social science background, either sociology, psychology, or something similar. Sometimes not full studies, but they had some encounters, let's say, with this. And it was interesting thing because I started to work at the university in autumn of 1976. And I was probably extremely lucky. Well, to be honest, my university studies were also not something what you may expect from Central and Eastern Europe. Because if you studied in Eastern Germany, you were fed exclusively on Marxist diet and nothing else. And it was, let's say, primitive Marxist diet, orthodox Marxist diet. Neither my legal studies nor sociological studies were like this, because most law professors were either pre-war law professors or direct pupils of such people, which meant that they were normal people, let's say. Of course, they had to live within certain realities, but still there was, well, unless no one, of course, explicitly criticized things, etc., but still those were decent, interesting lectures and other classes in legal matters. I would say that the same was the case in sociology, where most of things we were doing, we were reading, we were discussing, were things from American sociology. Practically no one spoke about Soviet sociology, if something like this ever existed, or similar things. So everything was American. So the faculty was also, even if those were people who were, for example, members of the Communist Party, etc., it was just, impossible. They were usually quite good sociologists in many respects, and they realized that it's impossible to speak about sociology without referring constantly to Western experience, Western American science, etc. So this was the first thing that I learned certain things, not somewhere underground in secret meetings, etc. There were certain limits to academic freedom, but still it was not so terrible as some people in the West could suspect at that time. And when I started, and there was also one thing additional, which this was a huge difference between Poland and practically all other countries of the region, with exception again of Hungary, that we were able to have some contacts with Western universities, Western colleagues, American universities, American colleagues, etc. It was not unproblematic very often. There were some trouble that people were refused passports, for example, to travel to the West, etc. But in principle, it was possible. And for my, let's say, development, there were crucial two things. First of all, at the end of the 1970s, Jagiellonian has signed some sort of cooperation and exchange agreement with American University, University of Connecticut. By the way, at that time at the University of Connecticut, Cohen was present, so it was quite interesting. That's how I met and attended his class. Americans, it was one person from Poland, from Krakow, to go for a year as a graduate student to Storrs, Connecticut, within the framework of this agreement. And earlier there was one of the professors at UConn visiting Krakow, and Americans said he met me. He knew that I speak more or less decent English already at that time, and they said that they want me as a first to go in this exchange program. So in 1980, I was lucky enough to have an opportunity to go for a year to be at the University of Connecticut, to attend classes, to collect my materials for my PhD, etc., etc. And it was, of course, an extremely important experience. I wouldn't say that it changed my view of the world, but it had certainly significant impact on my perceptions of many things. Not to mention that I've got direct access to the literature in criminology. I had contact with people like Albert Cohen, who was at that time already quite old and practically half retired, but still it was impressive things because I knew the name, of course, from earlier experience. So this was one thing which established some of my contacts with American colleagues. You know, it is astonishing. I don't know why, because at that time it was common for people who were departing for such scholarships in the West to be invited by secret political police with offer, well, you know, we need some information. Could you be of any help? I was never summoned. I just received passport, received my American visa, and flown to New York and spent a year in UConn. Then, of course, the solidarity martial law has been introduced, etc., etc. I finished my PhD. I was already doctor, and at that time, it was, well, I wouldn't say easy, but there was a very strong support from Germany for Poland in general and Polish scholars in particular. And Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung, which is equivalent of Fulbright, American Fulbright, provided extremely intensively scholarships for Polish researchers. Practically most of the people from my Institute of Criminal Law at that time at Jagiellonian visited Max Planck Institute in Freiburg, either as Max Planck scholars or Humboldt scholars. And I obtained Humboldt scholarship in 1987. Well, I spent in Freiburg 16 months altogether, which was, again, yet another formative period for me. By the way, it was the only time when I was in Freiburg that I met Leon Radzinovich. He used to live already at that time in Philadelphia, in the United States, but he came to Freiburg in search of materials for such a booklet on the history of International Criminal Law Association. It was published by Max Planck Institute. He met with the Polish community also at Max Planck. There were some 8 people, I think, from Poland at that time at Max Planck, and we had meeting with him. So I was lucky enough to meet some prominent personalities in world criminology.
This is really too much information. We have to go slowly. So it was 1980 Connecticut, and the Max Planck was in
81. It was Connecticut.
Yeah.
And 87, 88 Max Planck.
Max Planck. So when you went to the USA, well, of course, it's 1980. Solzhenitsyn published Gulag Archipelago in 1974. So many people were already, many of the longtime Marxists had already been changing their ideas. But I suppose that you met some, still there were some Marxists of the old school, the Western Marxists. How was this contact with these persons that had a different idea of what was going on behind the Iron Curtain?
Well, you know, honestly speaking, I never had close contact with a real real Western Marxist or a real discussion. Well, most people with whom I had contacts in the United States were either Americans, Eastern European emigres. There was a group of faculty members, professors at UCAN who emigrated from Eastern Europe, from Hungary after 1956 or from Germany. They were hardly Marxists because of their experience. But there was also some other aspects to this, because I met some Polish emigres in Connecticut who were, of course, staunchly anti-communist, what was absolutely understandable, no way. But when I talked to them, I probably not at that time, but now I realize this, that they were suspecting me of being some sort of whoever knows who he is. How it was possible that he came here, what he talks about, and unless he repeats every second sentence anti-communist paroles, he must be some sort of suspicious person. You know,
connected to the Secret Service, police.
Yeah. Well, you know, that's obvious that it was somehow justified. You know, of course they could probably, because most of those people had some acquaintances with other people in Poland, they could check about this, etc. But there was this strange relation. But as I said, I never practically had a chance to discuss at that time with real Western Marxists certain things. Of course, I was able to read some things extremely critical, for example, written from Marxist perspective about solidarity, about this Polish revolution, let's say, etc., that it is what was absolutely true, to a certain extent, staunchly conservative Catholic, etc. What we face the consequences now to a certain extent, they were extremely critical about this workers acting against communist progressive government. Well, but those were published things, really no way, no chance to approach a real Western communists. They were hiding somewhere, probably.
Okay, that's interesting. And also, well, you mentioned Radzinovich. I was just to make a comparison because I discussed once with Miklos Levay, and he said that Denis Sabo, who escaped from Hungary, he was in contact since the 1980s with Hungary. He was going back to Budapest. And so I was wondering, Radzinovich did not keep...
He was in Poland only once after World War II. He was invited by the government. That was a visit during the 1970s. He was already retired from Cambridge, I think, at that time. And he was invited with a group of, let's say, scholars, researchers of various areas of Polish origin. And they were there was a tour in Poland arranged for them by the government. And I remember even in one of the weeklies at that time, I have read an article about this, and Radzinovich was mentioned there, that he was present. And he mentions this, I think, in his Adventures of Criminology, that he was in Poland only once. But it does not mean that he had no contacts with Poland, because one of his articles, which was about the crime and economic conditions, which was prepared when he was still in Poland, and it was published in English 1939 or 1940, and mentioned Professor Jasiński, translated it into Polish, and arranged for being published in 1970s, I think, in Polish. So it was the only one thing by Radzinovich which was published in Polish after World War II. And therefore he maintained some sort of contact with Jasiński. They knew each other. And he maintained also contact with a guy, his name was Krzysztof Krajewski. He was a secretary of State and Law, this legal journal, a pupil of Batavia, who was also partly criminologist, and he was also traveling a little bit. Primarily, he visited, he was in some contact with the United Nations. And he attended those UN conferences, etc. And he met Radzinovich for a couple of times.
It's quite incredible to think that he spent 45 years, because he left immediately after World War II, huh?
Before.
Ah, before?
Before, 37. 37, he departed in 1937.
So for 60 years, in 60 years, he went back only once.
Only once. Well, many people who left because of communist takeover were reluctant to visit Poland because of various reasons, Some were afraid of eventual sort of political entrapment, whatever. They didn't like to visit country under communist rule. Some of them, it is difficult to say, but it may also have something to do that because Radzinovich's father was a doctor, very well-known doctor, specialist in throat diseases, and he was killed by Germans during the World War II. Oh. Yes, he died in Auschwitz, I think. And of course, for Radzinovich, this could be also some sort of of traumatic experience. I don't know whether it was really, but some were coming without any problems. Some just cut off contacts with country, although not completely, because he had some contacts with Polish people, Polish scholars, and maintained some sort of communication.
Yeah, one tend to forget how terrible all that was, and the life he could have had under another circumstances, a completely different life. I checked during the break that we made the short biography by Roger Hood, and yes, so he went to Rome to study with Ferri, which means that he was fluent in Italian, probably.
Probably, although his doctorate was published in French.
Yeah, and that is what I checked. Roger Hood mentions the School of Law. I suppose it's the Faculty of Law in Geneva, where he was a private docent, and he published also in French. Because Ferri also has La Sociologie Criminelle, Criminal Sociology, his book. He published it in French, and he signs Henri Ferri. He doesn't sign Enrico Ferri. I don't know, maybe it's the editor that changed it. I don't know, but and now it's available because everything is in PDF. It is there, and so probably they could use French. I have to check again.
It may be that they communicated in French, but Radzinovich spent a couple of years in Rome, I think so. So he had picked up some Italian. Certainly, there's no way to avoid this when you live in Rome.
So we know that you have to leave in 5 minutes because you have a class. But I have we introduced with Lieven a kind of bonus question, and is how crime has changed in your country during your lifetime. Or even your country changed. It's more difficult for you than from someone who comes from, I don't know, Italy, for example. But what would you say?
In 1990, there was a general expectation and belief that we, Poland, are going back to Europe. We were cut off from Europe for 50 years. And now we have to go back and to catch up with everything European, which means economy, culture, politics, and crime. Socialist Poland, or generally socialist countries, were supposed to be free of crime. This was a Marxist prediction, that crime will disappear with the development of the most progressive political and economic system in mankind's history. It was not necessarily true, but nevertheless, because of various reasons, probably, crime existed, but was quite different, and at least in official terms, in terms of registered offenses rate, crime was much, much lower than in Western Europe. The best example, which I give always to my students, is comparison of Western and Eastern Germany, because the registered offenses rate in Western Germany at the end of the 1980s was something like 7,000 per 100,000 population. In Eastern Germany, it was 700 per 100,000 population, so 10 times lower. Was it a credible thing? Certainly not. Crime offenses were under-registered, were, let's say, hidden in various ways for ideological reasons, because the problem was to prove at any price that socialism is much better than capitalism, etc., etc. But it is true that, let's say, streets and certain places were probably much safer than they became after 1990. After 1990, crime started to get normal. And I would say that there were two phases, The first one was 1990s, which was a really problematic thing. There was a huge growth of crime, of registered offenses, although it's no time to elaborate on this, but in many respects it was probably more a statistical artifact than real development. But partly it was a real development because of one thing, that when you have such deep, profound political, social, and economic transformation, we know from the times of Durkheim that it has impact on crime. That rapid social transformation has negative impact on crime. It creates anomie and whatever else, okay? So this growth of crime was real, especially what made people to be afraid of was organized crime. Because this was something what during the 1990s was probably new, unexpected. Also crimes committed with firearms, which were unheard of before the 1990s and so on. But I would say with around 2005, things started to stabilize. And let's say, well, since years, registered offenses go down in Poland, what is similar to trends in many other European countries, that generally certain offenses rates are rather declining. I would say that if there were certainly people who felt insecure on streets of some Polish cities during the 1990s, it could be even me. Now, I don't feel huge difference between Krakow, Warsaw, Berlin, or some other European cities.
But this is because you got used to living in a Western style, or because crime went down in Krakow after the 90s?
Both, probably both, I think. And there is also it is an interesting thing to mention, because Poland was the only one Eastern European country which participated in all sweeps of ICVS. So we have a nice time series since 1990, as a matter of fact. And then there were, after, because ICVS was not repeated since 2004, I think.
Yes.
But it was repeated in Poland. The questionnaire, which was used for the purpose of victimization surveys in Poland, was practically identical with ICVS questionnaire, what makes possible comparisons, And I show it always, this juxtaposition of registered offenses trends and victimization trends in Poland. Registered offenses trends, especially in the second half of the 1990s, went up enormously, while victimization rates were constantly, slowly, but going down. How to explain this? And there is very good explanation when you look at readiness to report offenses, which you have also from ICVS. In 1990, only about 33% of victimizations were reported to the police. In recent years, more than 50% were reported. So during the last 30 years, readiness to report increased unbelievably, but of course must have had enormous, tremendous impact on registered offenses rate. So it was this growth of crime may be attributed, probably at least partly, to changes in readiness to report offenses, and not necessarily to real developments in crime. Of course, there was growth of crime, no way to deny this, but you have always to take into consideration this other aspect as well.
Okay, perfect. This was very clear. I will leave the last word to Lieven, because I talk too much today, as always. But I would really like to thank you, because we've known each other for 20 years, since the beginnings of the ESC, and you organized the conference in 2005, which means that we discussed a lot during all these years. I remember the dinner with clappings in Krakow, that maybe one day we can. Well, it was nothing that cannot be said, but okay.
The restaurant still exists.
Okay, that we should go back.
Right pandemic.
So that was a nice anecdote, but yeah, maybe one day we can tell it. It was very nice, but we discussed many times, but there are things that that I really didn't know and that are fascinating about your biography, even if the focus of our podcast is in the development of criminology in Europe, not at the individual level. But I think you said much more today than in the interview for the oral history project.
I think so. Yeah, but it was completely different,
Yeah. So it was. Yeah, it's fascinating, and all the things that you saw changing during all these years. Yeah, I'm really happy to have had this discussion because a lot of things I didn't know, even if we had discussed many times and alone. So, but yeah, I learned a lot today. Thank you very much, Krzysztof.
Glad to hear this.
Yeah, thank you very much as well. I mean, I could repeat the same. I mean, it's fascinating to hear about details which are not always so clear from an outsider's point of view. Even if we work in the same field and have discussed things earlier, it still is fascinating, both at the individual level and at the level of criminology. There are so many similarities from a purely historical point of view, but also differences which, I mean, one would not expect, because people tend to generalize. I mean, like you said, I mean, the idea that it's just the West is one part of the world and the former communist countries are one part. It's not like that. And I think this is one of the important contributions. I hope our listeners will enjoy hearing about these subtle differences. So thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you.
This was
You're
a
welcome.
most enjoyable interview, and I hope to discuss things further later on if we have an opportunity on the next conference.
In Florence.
Yeah.
In Florence,
In
gentlemen.
Florence, yeah.
All right.
But a lot of things that you said need to be kept for the
Yeah,
future. We
absolutely.
didn't talk about cybercrime, for example, and but this we will have the time to do it again. And I think it's
Okay.
a very good testimony also for the people that will hear this a
Exactly.
few years from now.
So glad to meet you, and take care, gentlemen, and see you soon in
See you
person.
soon, Krzysztof. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye. Bye.
Thank you for following Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast. This podcast is edited by Eduardo Coco from the University of Lausanne. Our theme song is Seagull's Night, Noche de Gaviotas, composed by Gustavo Cantero, arranged by Tato Germano, and played by Tato and Gustavo with the voices of Sasha Conte and Alejandro Turco Gujot. Your hosts are Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium, and Marcelo Aevi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. Cheers, and see you soon.